In July 2015, a cattle station in the Kimberley went on the market for the first time in 133 years. 400,000 hectares, 15,000 head of cattle. Frontage on 2 rivers, 30 kilometres from Fitzroy Crossing. The selling agent said he had seen nothing that compared to it in 50 years with elders. The bidding reportedly drew in Andrew Forrest and Kerry Stokes and money from overseas, and it was bought by Gina Rinehart for a reported $30 million, a figure that was never officially confirmed. And to put cattle on that ground in the first place, 2 brothers had walked a herd 5,600 kilometres across the width of Australia. It took them 3 years and 3 months. They had set out with 700 cattle and 60 horses. They arrived with 327 cattle and 13 horses. Before we go any further, if you want to keep these stories alive, I've created a book with the complete Australian lost factories. The workers, the gates, the Australian maid, all gone. The link is on the first line of the description. Back to the story. A note before we begin. This story contains the names of Aboriginal people who have died. It is told on Gooniyandi and Boonabah country in the Kimberley. Chapter 1. Not Poor. The family came from Broadford on the Isle of Skye, and they emigrated in the 1830s. By the 1880s they were at Clifford's Creek near Lagan, north of Crookwell, in the southern tablelands of New South Wales. Inland country, about 200 kilometres southwest of Sydney, cold in winter, good grass, long settled. Clifford's Creek was not frontier country. It had been settled for 50 years. There were fences, neighbours, a road to Goulburn and a rail line beyond it. Now, before this story goes any further, it is going to do something deliberately, because the audience for these films has earned it. The MacDonalds were not poor. There is no runaway boy in this one. No 5 shillings, no one-eyed horse, no orphan with nothing in his pockets. They were an established grazing family on some of the best watered country in New South Wales, and they had been there for a generation. Donald MacDonald, known to everyone as Dan, had made money prospecting for gold, and in the words of the family's own historian, he had a good eye for property. He would go on to buy several properties around Goulburn. The Mackenzies, family friends related by marriage, put up the operating finance for what came next and paid the first year's rent on the lease. That rent was £25. So why is this still one of the hardest stories in Australian pastoral history? Because of what they did with the money. 700 head of cattle and 60 horses is not a modest herd. In 1883, that is a substantial capital asset, the accumulated work of years, the thing a family like that spends its life building up and protecting. They put every animal they owned on the road and pointed it at a place on the far side of the continent that not one of them had ever seen. And they very nearly lost the lot, rather more than half of it in fact, before it was over. That is the honest starting position, and it is stated up front for a reason. This channel has been pulled up before for a rags to riches framing that did not survive the arithmetic, and it was a fair criticism. So here it is without the polish. Money, land, backing, and a herd. What they did not have was any idea what they were walking into. One correction before we go on, because the family have been making it for 140 years. It is MacDonald. M-A-C, capital D, not MacDonald. And there is a detail in the family record that tells you how ordinary the risk looked at the time. The lease was taken out in 1882. The cattle did not leave until March of 1883. They had the better part of a year to think about it, to look at the map, to talk to anybody who had been north and to change their minds. Nobody changed their mind. And the reason any of them went at all was a book. Chapter 2. Forrest's Diary. In 1879, a surveyor named Alexander Forrest led an expedition across the Kimberley in the far northwest of Western Australia. He came back and wrote up what he had seen, and what he had seen was country. nobody in the eastern colonies had any idea existed. Open downs, black soil, grass to a horse's belly, 3 separate river systems running through it. Dan MacDonald, sitting on a property outside Goulburn, 3,500 kilometres away, read that report, and then he did something that is genuinely difficult to believe and which is documented. He chose the exact site off the page. The junction of the Margaret and the Fitzroy Rivers. 100 square miles of it. In 1882, he took out a pastoral lease over that ground, on the strength of another man's diary, having never stood on it, never seen a photograph of it, and having no realistic way of getting there to check. Understand what a decision like that actually is. There were no aerial photographs. There was no second opinion available. Forrest had ridden through in one season, and one season in northern Australia tells you almost nothing about the next. If he had passed through in a good year, everything he wrote was true and useless, and a note on that river because it causes confusion every single time. The Margaret River in this story is a Kimberley River in the tropical northwest. It is not the wine district south of Perth. They are about 2,500 kilometres apart. Forrest's report did not just move the MacDonalds. It started a land rush. The Duracks were part of it. So were Osmond and Panton, who hired the great drover Nat Buchanan. Within 5 years, the Kimberley went from a blank space on the map to the most contested pastoral frontier in the country. But here is what Forrest's diary gave them, and what it did not. It gave them a direction. It did not tell them where the water was. And across Queensland, the Barkly Tableland and the Northern Territory, the only people on the continent who knew that were the people already living there. That was true of the Durack Drove, where the record states plainly that the party survived only with the help of desert Aboriginal people, and there is no reason to think this one was different. For the MacDonald Drove specifically, that dependence is documented at the level of the region rather than incident by incident, and this film will say so rather than invent the detail. And one more thing about Forrest's report, because it explains why so many families moved at once. He did not just describe good country, he described country that was unoccupied and available, and in the language of a colonial surveyor, those 2 words did an enormous amount of work. The country was neither. It simply had nobody on it that a surveyor was prepared to count. On the 26th of March, 1883, they went. Chapter 3. 3 years and 3 months. They left Clifford's Creek in the last week of March, 1883. Name them because they deserve it. Charlie MacDonald was drover in charge. With him went his brothers Willie and Duncan and Jim McGeorge and Duncan Mackenzie. Peter Thompson and Jasper Pickles handled the bullock teams and the wagons. Charlie was about 32 years old. Willie was 23. Now understand what a drove of this length actually is, because the phrase does not convey it. Cattle do not move at the speed of a horse. They move at the speed of grass, because they have to eat as they walk. And if you push them harder than they can feed, they lose condition and start to die. 10 miles is a good day. Some days you make nothing at all, waiting at a river or holding the mob while somebody rides ahead to find water. When the wet season catches you, you stop, sometimes for months. They expected the journey to take 2 years. It took 3 years and 3 months, and it began by killing one of them. Their father, Donald MacDonald, was thrown from a horse early in the journey and died. There are 2 Donalds in this story, and the sources tangled them constantly, so let me be clear. The father died on the road. His son Dan, also Donald, was the one who held the lease. Dan stayed behind, funded the venture, and lived until 1937. Through the Queensland drought, the party began to break up. Most of the men who had set out turned back before Cooper's Creek, and nobody should think less of them for it. They had signed on for a job with an end date, and the end date had stopped meaning anything. Then, in 1885, somewhere near Katherine, in the Northern Territory, Charlie collapsed with redwater fever, a tick-borne disease that kills cattle and can flatten a man. He was taken out through Darwin and shipped home by sea, which left Willie MacDonald, at 25, alone with what was left of the herd and a helper somewhere in the Territory, with the hardest leg still ahead of him. The Australian Dictionary of Biography covers that final stage in one phrase: after 11 months of hardship. One more thing about the record of this journey. The period accounts refer to trouble with marauding Aboriginals along the route. That is the language of the men who wrote it down, and it describes people defending their own country from a herd of cattle walking through it. This film is going to say that rather than repeat the phrase as though it were neutral, there is a question worth asking here that the romantic version never asks. Why did Willie keep going? He was 25. His father was dead. His brother had been shipped home half alive. Most of the men had turned back, and more than half the cattle were gone. Nobody in New South Wales would have blamed him for selling what was left in the Territory and taking a ship home. The record does not tell us why he stayed. It only tells us that he did. On the 3rd of June, 1886, what was left of it walked in at the junction. Chapter 4, 327. The junction of the Margaret and the Fitzroy sits in the central Kimberley, about 50 kilometres northeast of what is now Fitzroy Crossing. 700 cattle and 60 horses had left Clifford's Creek. What walked in at the junction was 327 cattle and 13 horses. The subtraction is the story. 373 cattle and 47 horses died between Lagan and the Fitzroy, more than half the herd, nearly 4 horses in every 5. Every one of those losses was a separate small disaster, somewhere between New South Wales and the Kimberley. A dry stage, a flooded crossing, a night the mob rushed and scattered, 3 years of them, one after another. That is what the family's entire capital looked like after 3 years on the road. Not a fortune, 327 animals, thin, footsore, standing in a river junction hundreds of kilometres from anywhere that could be called a town. And they had no reserve. There was no second herd coming behind them, no bank willing to lend against a lease in country nobody had seen, and no way to buy replacement stock within 1,000 kilometres. Whatever survived the walk was the entire business. Now the date and a correction. The arrival was the 3rd of June, 1886. There is a monument standing near that ground today, and it says 1885. It is wrong by a year, and it also compresses the departure. The family's own written account, the Dictionary of Biography, and a Sydney Morning Herald article from 1937 all give 1886. The plaque was unveiled 70 years after the event, and it telescoped the timeline. Now the distance, and this is the claim the film's title rests on, so it is going to be handled carefully rather than shouted. 5,600 kilometres, 3,480 miles. Nat Buchanan moved more cattle than this. In 1881, he took 20,000 head from St George in Queensland to Glencoe in the Northern Territory, and that remains the largest cattle drive in Australian history by number. The Duracs moved a much bigger herd a shorter distance. 7,250 head over about 4,800 kilometres, arriving at the Ord River in 1885. The MacDonalds walked the longest by distance. That is the honest version, and it is the one this film will use every time. So why has almost nobody heard of them? Because the Duracs had Mary Durack, who wrote Kings in Grass Castles in 1959, and made her family a national legend. The MacDonalds had nobody. They walked further and they were forgotten. And the difference between the two outcomes is a writer. And the thing about being forgotten is that it compounds. No book means no film, and no film means no tourism, and no tourism means no reason for anybody outside the district to learn the name. The Duracs got kings in grass castles and then a mini-series. The MacDonalds got a plaque with the wrong year on it. And the country they had walked all that way to reach was not empty. Chapter 5. Gooniyandi Country. Fossil Downs sits on the boundary between two nations. Bunuba Country runs to the north and the west. The Napier and Oscar Ranges, Windajana Gorge, Tunnel Creek, limestone country full of caves and permanent water. Gooniyandi Country runs east and south from Fitzroy Crossing, and the Gooniyandi Aboriginal Corporation names Fossil Downs among the stations that sit on their country. The two languages are the only members of the Bunuban family, and one linguist has put the relationship between them at about the distance between English and Dutch. These are not vague groupings. They are nations, with boundaries, law and title. And 8 years after the MacDonalds arrived, that district became the site of the bloodiest frontier conflict in the recorded history of Western Australia. His name was Jandamara. He was a Bunuba man, born around 1873, who had worked as a stockman and was reckoned the best in the district, and who then took work as a police tracker. The settlers called him Pigeon. In late 1894, at the abandoned police post at Lillimalura, he shot Constable William Richardson, a man he had worked alongside, and released the Bunuba prisoners who were being held there in chains. Among them was their leader, Elamara. What followed was 2.5 years of armed resistance. On the 16th of November 1894, at Windajana Gorge, about 30 police and colonists faced roughly 50 of Jandamara's men in a standoff that lasted 8 hours. Elamara was killed. Jandamara was badly wounded and got away, and the fact that he survived it gave him a reputation among his own people that the police never overcame. He was finally shot dead at Tunnel Creek on the 1st of April 1897. Now the reprisals, and they need to be stated at their real size. The historians Howard Pedersen and Banjo Wurrun-Murrah describe what the police did afterwards as the most sustained slaughter of Aboriginal people in Western Australia's history. The official police figure was 84 people shot dead between November 1894 and March 1895. The same historians say that number was unquestionably a fraction of those who actually died. Bunuba descendants say several hundred, and here is the finding this film has to report, because it is what the research actually produced. No source connects the MacDonalds or Fossil Downs to any of it. Not to a punitive expedition, not to a named massacre site. The fighting was on Bunuba country west and northwest of Fitzroy Crossing. Fossil Downs is about 50 kilometres northeast of the town, on Gooniyandi ground. So here is the honest version, and it is not comfortable either way. The MacDonalds built an empire in the same decade, in the same district, during the worst frontier violence this state has ever recorded, on country that was taken from the people who held it. And their own record says nothing at all about it. That silence is the finding. This film is not going to manufacture a link that the archive does not support, and it is not going to pretend the silence means nothing. There is one more thing worth saying about Jandamara, because he is usually described as a rebel, and that misses what actually frightened the colony. He had been trained by the police. He could shoot, he could ride, he knew how a patrol thought and where it would camp, and he knew the limestone country well enough to disappear into it. He was not an outsider attacking the system. He was somebody the system had built, turning around. And by the 1920s, half of Fossil Downs belonged to somebody else entirely. Chapter 6. Half of it was Kidman's. The story everyone tells about Fossil Downs is 133 years of one family, unbroken, the longest continuous family ownership in the Australian pastoral industry. It is nearly true, and there are two things wrong with it. The first is that they never owned the land. Not 1 hectare of it, not on any day in 133 years. Fossil Downs was a Crown pastoral lease from the first day to the last. That is the same arrangement that underpinned Sydney Kidman's 3% of the continent and the Durack's empire on the Ord. What the MacDonalds held was the right to run cattle across country the Crown claimed to own. That is what everybody in the Kimberley held, and it is what the whole northern cattle industry was built on. The second thing is the one almost nobody knows. In the 1920s, Sir Sidney Kidman bought a half share in Fossil Downs for £75,000. The Cattle King owned half of it. Dan MacDonald and his brother Duncan bought him back out in 1928, and before Kidman there had been the Mackenzies, who had paid that first £25 rent and stayed as partners in the enterprise from 1883 until about 1900. Which means the MacDonalds did not hold Fossil Downs on their own until about 15 years after the drove finished, and then lost half of it again for most of a decade in the 1920s. Now the loop, and it is the single best fact in this story. The woman who bought Fossil Downs in July 2015 was Gina Rinehart. 18 months later, in December 2016, her company bought S. Kidman and Company. 90 years after the Cattle King owned half of this station, the person who owns the entire Kidman empire owns all of it. It is worth naming what leasehold actually meant for a family like this, because it cuts both ways. It let them control 1 million acres without ever having the capital to buy it, which is the only reason the empire was possible at all. It also meant that after 133 years, what they finally sold in 2015 was not land. It was a lease, a herd, and a house. And one more correction while we are here. The romance of this story is the drove, and the drove deserves it. But the early money did not come out of those 327 cattle. It came from Dan MacDonald's gold and the Mackenzies' finance, and from a piece of luck nobody could have planned. In 1885, gold was struck at Halls Creek, a few hundred kilometres east. The Kimberley suddenly filled with hungry men who needed beef and had money to pay for it, and the MacDonalds had the only substantial herd in the district, and that is worth holding against the drove for a moment. 3 years of walking, more than half the herd dead. A father buried on the road, and the thing that finally made the family money was a gold strike. A few hundred kilometres away that had nothing to do with any of it. That is not a criticism, it is how most pastoral fortunes were actually made. The romance is in the walk, the money was in the market. And then a grandson who had trained as an architect decided to build a house. Chapter 7. The Taj Mahal of the Kimberley. William Neil Mitchell. MacDonald was born in 1910 and he was a trained architect. He took control of Fossil Downs in 1939, and the year before that, in 1938, he had married a Sydney model named McCain. The old homestead was wood and iron and riddled with termites, so he pulled it down and built her a new one, about 14 kilometres away. What he built was a 2-storey brick house in the middle of the Kimberley. The bricks were made from clay dug on the property. The house is arranged over 2 floors around a central hall. The Art Deco Jarrah staircase was built in Perth and carted across the state to the station. The roof timbers are local Leichhardt pine and native fig. It is on the State Heritage Register, which calls it a remarkable achievement in so remote a location. People in the district started calling it the Taj Mahal of the Kimberley, and the name stuck. Maxine MacDonald left an oral history recording in 1966, and it is the human centre of this whole story. She arrived in 1938 as a young bride from Sydney, with no station experience whatsoever. She flew nearly all day to get there, via Carnarvon, Port Hedland and broom. And when she finally reached the station, the river was running and there was no vehicle on the far side of it. So she waded across. And somewhere in that house, hanging on the wall of the hallway, went the waterbag the brothers had carried the whole 5,600 kilometres. There is something worth noticing in that house, beyond the staircase. A man who could have built anything, in a place where nobody would ever see it, built something formal. 2 stories, a central hall, proportion, symmetry. It was not for visitors. There were barely any. It was a statement about what the family had become, made to an empty landscape. By the early 1950s, Fossil Downs ran to about 1 million acres. It was described at the time as the largest privately owned cattle station in Australia. It carried more than 20,000 branded cattle, and it had been exporting around 1,500 head a year to Java through the port of Derby since 1915. The workforce was 20 white staff and 60 Aboriginal employees. Say that ratio out loud, because it is the whole northern cattle industry in one line. 3/4 of the people working that station were Aboriginal, on Gooniyandi country, in an era when Aboriginal station workers across northern Australia were paid in rations rather than wages. And here is a gap this film is going to name, rather than paper over. Not one individual Aboriginal Fossil Downs worker is named in any source this research could reach. 60 people on that station in the 1950s, and the record does not carry their names. And there is a reason that gap exists, and it is not an accident of filing. Station books recorded white employees by name because they were paid wages, and recorded Aboriginal workers as numbers because they were issued rations. The accounting produced the silence. 100 years later, the silence is what is left. And then the war came to the Kimberley. Chapter 8. Wyndham. On the morning of the 3rd of March, 1942, Japanese aircraft attacked Broome. 88 people were killed. 22 aircraft were destroyed, most of them flying boats sitting on the water in Roebuck Bay, many of them full of Dutch civilians who had been evacuated from Java. The same morning, 8 fighters hit Wyndham at the top of the Kimberley and cratered the airfield. Wyndham mattered to this family more than anywhere else in the north. The meatworks there had opened in 1919, and it was the outlet for Kimberley cattle. It was the end of the road that every mob in that country was walking towards. It paused operations from 1942 to 1945. The reasoning was blunt, and it was correct. A working meatworks on the northern coast, in a district that had just been bombed, was a food supply for an invading army, and the government was not going to leave one running. So the cattle went south instead. Kimberley and Territory mobs will walk down the Marangi stock route towards Queensland, where the demand was and where the troops were. Around 47,000 head went down that route in 1942 alone. And the state ship Kulama, bombed off the Kimberley coast in February, limped into Wyndham and rolled over at the wharf on the 3rd of March, the same day the bombers came. Now, Fossil Downs itself. There is a claim that the station was used by the military during the war, and this film is going to tell you exactly what that claim is worth. 2 sources make it, and they contradict each other. Hancock, the current owner, says it was used as an army headquarters. The State Heritage Record says it was used by the RAAF. Neither cites a military source. No unit, no dates, no capacity could be corroborated. That is station law, not record, and you should hear it as law. Nor is there any documented MacDonald war service. Charlie and Willie were both dead before the First World War. Dan was far too old, and the architect was running a cattle station the country needed. That is an absence of evidence rather than proof of anything. The real disaster of this era was not the war at all. In 1952 and 1953, a drought went through the district and halved the cattle numbers across it. William Neal Mitchell MacDonald was made a member of the Order of the British Empire in 1956, and the citation reads for services to the pastoral industry. Not for war service. He died in 1963, and he is buried in the station cemetery, on the ground he built the house on. He had inherited a station his uncles had walked to, and his father had held through the Depression. He turned it into the largest privately owned cattle run in the country, and put a 2-story house in the middle of it. He was 53 years old when he died, and Fossil Downs passed to his daughter. Chapter 9. The One Who Quit. Annette was the daughter of William and Maxine, and a granddaughter of Dan MacDonald. In 1968, she and her husband, John Henwood, took over Fossil Downs, and they ran it for the next 47 years. Something else happened in 1968, and it changed the Kimberley permanently. The equal wage decision reached the Northern Pastoral Award. From December of that year, Aboriginal station workers in the Kimberley were entitled to the same wage as anybody else doing the same job. Until then, they had been receiving somewhere between $6 and $20 a week, against an award rate of close to 40. What happened across Northern Australia is well documented, and it is not a happy story. Rather than pay the wage, a great many stations simply let their Aboriginal workers go. Families who had lived and worked on that country for generations, on their own country, were moved off it, and ended up in fringe camps on the edge of towns like Fitzroy Crossing. Peter Yu, who later led the Kimberley Land Council, wrote that the decision broke the back of the feudal relationship between station managers and Aboriginal families. Both halves of that sentence are true. It ended something that should have ended. It also put a great many people on the road. The Aboriginal community at Fossil Downs was later relocated a few kilometres away, across the river, to a place called Muluja. About 100 people live there today, most of them Gooniyandi speakers. 47 years is a long tenure by any measure. The Henwoods ran that station through the collapse of the northern beef market in the 70s, and through the shift from droving to road trains. They ran it through the rise and fall of live export. They ran it through a run of wet seasons and dry ones that emptied out neighbours on both sides of them. And now the ending, and here is where this film parts company with the last three. There is no feud, no litigation, no collapse, no villain. By 2015, the Henwoods were in their 70s. The station needed capital that a family operation could not raise. The live cattle export trade had been through the shock of the 2011 suspension, which hit Kimberley producers hard. And there was nobody behind them who wanted to take it on. So they sold it. And Annette Henwood said this on the record, and it is the best line in the entire story: "I feel an absolute traitor. I never wanted to be the one that quit after all that time and all that effort." There is a small, sad footnote to that. Back in 1910, Dan MacDonald had offered Fossil Downs to another member of the family, a man named Archie MacDonald. Archie turned it down because his bride would not move to the Kimberley. 105 years later, his descendants sold it and said she felt like a traitor. Two people in the same family, at opposite ends of the same century and the same station, was the thing neither of them could quite carry. In July 2015, the sign went up for the first time in 133 years. Chapter 10. The Same Cemetery. The agent was Malcolm French of Elders, and he told the ABC he had seen nothing that compared to Fossil Downs in 50 years with the company. Expressions of interest closed on the 2nd of July 2015, and the sale drew what he called unprecedented global and domestic interest. Around 8 bidders. Reportedly, Andrew Forrest and Kerry Stokes among them, along with offshore money, and that is as it was reported in the press rather than confirmed by anybody involved. The buyer was Gina Rinehart's Hancock Prospecting. The deal was done in late July and settled on the 31st of October 2015. The price has never been officially confirmed. French told the ABC that the guidance given to the market had been $25 to $30 million, and that the price obtained was certainly within expectations. A spokesman for Rinehart would not confirm a figure. So this film says a reported $30 million, and nothing more than that. What changed hands was 400,000 hectares, 15,000 drought-master cattle, frontage on both rivers and the house. And then the loop closed. 18 months later, Hancock bought S. Kidman and Company, the empire whose founder had owned half of this station 90 years earlier. One thing should be said plainly here, because the reflex in the comments will be to reach for it. Gina Rinehart is not the villain of this film. The Henwoods speak warmly of her on the record. She kept the homestead. She runs about 20,000 head on it, and she gathers her northern station managers there at Easter. She is the inheritor of this story, not its antagonist. 3 things the record insists on before we finish. It is MacDonald, with a capital D. The monument says 1885, and the arrival was 1886. And they were never poor. They were an established grazing family who bet everything they owned on a 3-year walk, which is a harder thing to do than starting with nothing, because they had something to lose. So what is left? The homestead still stands, and the Heritage Register still calls it remarkable. Muluja is still there across the river. The Gooniyandi hold native title over country around it. And at the junction, the Margaret still runs into the Fitzroy, the way it did before any of this started. And in the hallway of that house, the waterbag, the brothers carried 5,600 kilometres, is still hanging on the wall. It was carried by men who did not know whether the country at the end of it was worth reaching. It has outlasted every MacDonald who ever owned the place. Think about the arithmetic one last time. 327 cattle. 133 years, $30 million. And out at Goulburn, in the old cemetery on Mortar Street, the MacDonald overlanders are buried. So are the Duracks, in the same ground, a short walk away. 2 families left the same district in the same year and walked their cattle to the same corner of the continent. One of them went further. The other one had a writer. The waterbag is still on the wall.